Hi, and welcome to Inside Tacoma. I'm Brian Ebersole. Today, my guest is Randy Lewis, the retiring head of government relations for the city of Tacoma. Randy, we're changing things around a little bit.
Apparently
you
we
didn't
are.
know that I was going to be here, but Fred, your producer, asked me to come in and interview you for a little bit. And we're excited to hear that you're going to retire. I assume you have good things planned?
Yeah.
Maybe you could start by telling the people of the city, what will you do?
What will I do when
Yes.
I retire? Well, I'm going to continue to be a resident and taxpayer of the city of Tacoma, as I've been all of my working career, and proudly a member. And I'm going to find some way to be active in public policy. I'm not going to run for office or anything like that.
That's good to hear.
Yeah. But I've done public policy kind of work for more than 28 years because the city at the chamber, and kind of covering public policy as a reporter. So I just want to stay involved with that because it's kind of what I know. Whether that means on some board or commission or I don't know, being a podcast or there's so many different kinds of journalism available nowadays that you can do. I'll find some way of getting that done. But immediately right after I stop working at the end of July, I'm probably just going to sleep in for a while. Catch up on some books that I haven't finished reading and that are sitting on my table for a year or more.
Yeah, and naps. I find that naps between 3 and 5 every day are very important.
Oh, that's good to know.
Randy, I've known you for over 20 years when I was in the legislature and then my time as mayor. But some of our audience don't know much about you, the man. So tell us your abbreviated life story, where you were born, where you grew up, and anything you want to leave in or take out is okay.
All right. Well, I was born in Tacoma and grew up in South Tacoma and went to Edison, Gray, and Mount Tahoma, which I proudly tell people 3 schools that the school district then promptly tore down, and 2 of them they moved to completely different locations. So it's hard to even go back to look at them anymore, but I don't take that too personally. But grew up in that era of South Tacoma where a whole lot of folks were coming up. I mean, you're not a native of Tacoma, but you were in the same area about the same time. A good friend of yours, State Representative Steve Kirby, grew up down the street from me. Former Mayor Strickland grew up several streets over, though she's, I have to say, much younger than either of us.
Right.
But so yeah, it was a great place to grow up. I'm really happy that my youngest daughter and her husband just bought a house in South Tacoma. It's a great neighborhood. It's kind of gentrifying can be a bad word, but it's turning around. There's a lot of investment going on in South Tacoma, and it's a great neighborhood to grow up in. And so I'm really proud to be a South Tacoma guy. Went off to WSU because that's, if you want to be a journalist in broadcasting, that's where you went, to the Murrow School. And I did actually act as a journalist for maybe about 5 years. And AM radio was beginning its death throes back in the 70s, and Tacoma actually used to have several AM radio stations that did local broadcasting, and now I think we have like 1, and then there's an FM station, a publicly owned FM station. But radio is not what it once was, so I had to find a new career, and government relations seemed to be the thing to do. So that's the abbreviated version.
That's great. I thought of some serendipity there. I was a guidance counselor at Gray Junior High in the 70s, and my student assistant was a brilliant young woman named Marilyn Strickland. And when I became mayor, I asked Marilyn to serve on the library board, and then we were involved in getting her elected to the city council. She is great, and I know you're a big Marilyn Strickland fan as well. And then another piece of overlap in our lives, Steve Kirby and Tim Strage and a guy named Wendell Brown got me into politics in '82. You and your family have a special relationship to the Tacoma Fire Department. Can you tell the audience about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I do. My father was in the fire department for his entire career. Retired from the Tacoma Fire Department, had a long and happy retirement. And then my older brother, Larry, was a firefighter and one of the very first paramedics when the fire department got into the whole paramedic movement and the emergency medical programs were actually beginning in Tacoma and other fire departments across the state. He was one of the first, and retired, later as a paramedic firefighter. And then he also married the first woman to be a firefighter in Tacoma,
Eileen Lewis.
Who later became the chief.
Oh, that's
and
great.
is now retired. So yeah, I have this kind of connection to firefighters, going back from my father and my brother and my sister-in-law. So
That's great. That's great. I was driving here and thinking about our time together. You started lobbying the legislature in the 80s when you were working with the Tacoma Pierce County Chamber of Commerce.
That's correct.
What year was that, Randy?
it was about 1983. Yeah.
And as I remember, some of the issues that carried on for a long time, like the formation of UWT, the Chamber of Commerce and Randy Lewis were very much there in the inception.
Right. There were a few capital projects that people were really interested in. Well, the UWT is not just a capital project; it was a policy issue as well. But there were some things that the community has kind of rallied around some ideas. One was that. One was the Washington State Historical Society wanted to build a new museum instead of they'd outgrown the facility they have up at the Stadium District. And then there were some other capital needs, and it seemed like a way of coalescing all of that. Would put together like an agenda, and so we came up with something at the chamber we called it the Pierce County Action Agenda, and turned out legislators really liked that. I mean, it was like 4 little bullet points that everybody could kind of get their head around really quickly and all rally around, and we pulled that off through leadership of yours and others in Olympia, who said, yeah, these are good things that we can all do. And there's no partisanship about this, and it's not a Senate House thing. It's just, hey, this is good for our community. And it worked. So that's kind of the UW Tacoma. And I have to say, though, Mayor, that I think you were one of the very first people who said, yes, the UW Tacoma is going to be in Tacoma, but it's going to be in downtown Tacoma, because that's where it needs to be to truly be a catalyst for change in the community. And you look at where some of the other branch campuses that were approved, branch campuses, what they were called back then, and they were not in downtowns. There's one in Bothell, next to a community college. And the one in Vancouver, the WSU built, is kind of in the suburbs of Vancouver. This is the one that truly lived up to the potential, and that was because of leadership by yourself and others in Olympia that said, if we're going to do this, we're going to make this investment, we're going to maximize what we get out of it.
That's right. There were a lot of people involved. Dan Grimm was chairing Ways and Means from Puyallup. Art Wong, my good friend, was chair of the capital campaign, which appropriates the money. Ruth Fisher, now deceased, was a wonderful advocate. Senator Wojan, Rosa Franklin, Debbie Regala. We had a lot of strong legislators from the Tacoma area that really pulled together, and the Republicans, Stan Johnson, Shirley Winsley, I think now Senator O'Bain. We have a good support from both sides of the aisle for the university. What else do you remember from those days?
Well, I think the other thing that I've been asked is, what were big things that were changed as a Tacoma, and certainly the UW Tacoma, absolutely is one of those catalytic changes for Tacoma. But the other one is the Foss Waterway, and that was largely a city-done thing. The city council was the one who had to take the vote, which wasn't an easy vote. It was city manager Ray Corpus, the person who hired me, who had the idea and the dream about, well, what if we just, to clean this waterway up, what if we just put ourselves in the chain of title which meant that we're now liable for all the pollution that we didn't cause, but we're now liable if we buy the property, and we'll clean it up. And we can use like stormwater rates, and we can use some other grants that are available that we can go get that business can't get, and we can do something that business wasn't able to do and make this transformation of the Foss Waterway. People probably assume that was just always the way it was,
Right,
but it
right.
clearly was not, and
Right.
that was a major change to the city of Tacoma, along with the UW Tacoma.
And I would put in the same category in terms of its impact, the restoration of Ruston Way.
Right.
Tore down the old Dickman Mill in a partnership with Metro Parks. Now we have the glorious Point Ruston development. That transformation, in my opinion, of our Thea Foss Waterway and the Ruston Way waterway really changed the way outsiders viewed Tacoma. Now when you go down and walk along our waterway, you'll find people from Federal Way, Seattle, Tokyo, Beijing, and we really have come a long way in terms of being viewed as a fashionable, if you will, city that's vibrant and on the go.
Right, and even to the point that I just, with the new opening of the Dune Peninsula and the Frank Herbert Trail, honoring another great Tacoma author with a facility, even the Seattle Times did an editorial about how great what Tacoma has accomplished here is, from considering what it was, the slag stack from the Asarco smelter, to becoming that amazing park with the one-of-a-kind views up Puget Sound from there. Even the staid old Seattle Times said, "Wow, Tacoma, you did something really great here." So I kind of chuckled at that, but because Tacoma does great stuff all the time. We don't get credit for.
And let's not forget Point Defiance Park,
Right.
one of the best city parks in the nation, if not the world. It's
Absolutely.
and it's undergoing a transformation. What would you like your legacy to be? What do you want people to remember about your 28 years as Government Relations Officer for the city?
Well, there's a policy piece that I'm very proud of, which is somewhat controversial these days. But and then there's some capital stuff that I had a hand in, much more directly than I did with say Foss or the UW Tacoma, that I'm proud of. And the policy piece is after the legislature in the early '90s passed the Growth Management Act, which said that cities are the place where growth needs to occur, and cities need to take the actions necessary to accommodate that growth. You can't just pretend that you're not going to do it anymore. You have to be the place where growth occurs. Well, the city's planning staff at the time said, well, if that's going to happen, we need some tools to help incentivize that, because Tacoma still was transitioning from its old industrial ways to a new, hopefully different kind of economy and image. And so some incentives, because there's a truism, which is it costs just as much to build an office building or to build an apartment building in Seattle as it costs to build it in Tacoma. Steel costs the same, lumber costs the same, labor costs are the same. The difference is what you can charge for the rent or the lease. Mm-hmm. And Seattle, you can charge way more, so people are much more interested in building in King County in Seattle than they were in Tacoma. So one way of having an incentive was the multifamily housing tax abatement law, which passed, and you mentioned her name. Lorraine Wojan was the champion of that, and getting Lorraine on board really eased the passage, because you didn't stand in Lorraine's way, as you well know, when she wanted something. And so I just had to convince her that this was good policy, and when she became convinced of that, that bill passed in one session. And it provides that great property tax exemption on just the housing piece of new construction or rehabilitation. The land is always taxed, the commercial parts of any building are always taxed, and then the tax comes back on at the new value after, originally it was 10 years, and now it's either 8 or 12, depending on whether there's affordable housing. Tacoma has made really good use of that tool over the years. A lot of other cities clamored to be allowed to use it too, and the legislature widened that over time to every city in the state that's over 15,000 in population can use it, and it's been used a lot. I know it's controversial because giving tax breaks to developers is just controversial to some folks. But I'm not going to apologize for that. I think that was good policy, and it's led to some substantial increases in tax base in Tacoma, because some of the first projects came about right after the law passed. So they've been on the tax rolls for decades now, paying their full much higher value of property than they ever were paying before. So I'm very proud of having had a role in that, though I did not write that bill. That was written by the planning staff of the city of Tacoma.
Okay. I think one thing that we all owe to you, Randy, is the continuity of all the capital projects. We mentioned the university, the Union Station renovation, but then there was also the Art Museum, the Glass Museum, the Car Museum, the History Museum, the redo of the two waterways. And regardless if it was Mayor Vial, Mayor Ebersole, Barsma, Crawley, Strickland, or Victoria Woodards, we've all championed the same things, and the priorities haven't changed. And I think you had a lot to do with that. You've been here so long, and other senior staff, that you kept us understanding that the baton needs to be passed, and we need to run with the same agenda, not saying, well, I'm done with that. We're not going to do anything else with the museums, and we're going to move on to housing. So we've had continuity, and I think you and other senior staff deserve a lot of credit for that.
Well, I appreciate that, and it's true, because government doesn't do anything rapidly.
Right.
It takes time. There's public process, which is a good thing. We like public process in government. We complain sometimes, but we need to do things transparently and in the public, and with time for the press and the public to catch up to the things that the government's doing. And so it takes time, and I know people like to complain, oh, it's 2 years later than they said it would be, and that's nothing in government speak. Sometimes things have to get redesigned because what you originally planned turned out to be not something that was workable. So it's good to have some long-term staff that can provide that continuity. And I'm happy to have played that role. After a few years, I started being that role. Certainly didn't have it at first either, but I came in at a propitious time. There was beginning to be so much change in Tacoma with the things like the FOSS, growth management, the UW Tacoma, all of that beginning at right about the same time as I came in here. So I was happy to play that role. The physical things that, if I can talk about, that I'm really proud about, I think I've mentioned recently on the show, the convention center. You were mayor when that bill was passed. Right. That was a different era in state government too, because the state wasn't probably fully funding education by the court's rulings, so there was some state money available. So we were able to tap into some significant state money to build a really nice facility. And I remember in some comments from you at that time that we weren't going to build another bicentennial pavilion. We weren't going to build just some cheap little thing that we could afford to build. We needed to build something that would really work and last the community for a long time. And you didn't want it to be a box. You wanted it to have some style. And I think the building does have some style, and it is actually a building that is big enough to meet our needs for the future. And you're seeing the payoff. It took a little while because of the economy sinking in the late O's, but a new hotel being built right next to it, which is going to make it work even better as a facility. And again, the state played a key role in providing us with some key funding for that. And there's a lot of state money in that building. So having that was a big one. Helping keep AAA baseball in Tacoma by getting the state to do something it doesn't like to do, which is to fund stadiums. But by partnering with the single A teams in Washington State, we created a political power with Republican districts in rural cities and the Tacoma and Spokane together, working on one thing, and we were able to pull that one off too. And then the other one is the Murray Morgan Bridge, which was just this great piece of history, an important arterial street, and it just needed attention. You know, it was just a shame that this rusting hulk was sitting there in our downtown all those years because there was a dispute between the state and the city over whose responsibility it was. Mm-hmm. And once we cut past that, just settled that silly argument, we worked very well with DOT and got it done.
Yes, and I wanted to say that the current members of the Tacoma City Council are also very bright, creative, a little younger maybe than during my time. That's what 30 years, 40 years does to you. But Keith Blocker, Lillian Hunter, Robert Toms, Ryan Mello, Anders Ibsen, Catherine Urshko. Who am I missing? That's pretty close.
Don't put me on the spot.
Pretty close. Anyway,
we're both older now.
Good, really good, competent people are still coming forth and serving on the council. And I wanted to say also that the current legislative delegation is very strong with Kirby and Conway, Jeannie Darnell, Lori Jenkins, Melanie Morgan, Jake Fye. The 6 from the city plus the outlying areas are also very dedicated to the city's agenda and the greater Tacoma area.
Right. And this 2019 was a very successful legislative session for the city. I think the legislators generally believe it was a successful one for the legislature and for the state, and they handled some really major policy issues. But they also, you know, paid attention to local issues, and I feel my last session with the city was a very successful one. So
Great.
I feel very good about that. Can I ask you a couple questions?
Yes.
Because you know I'm curious about what happens to former mayors when they stop being mayor, and you've kind of had a different path. I mean, you had an art gallery. I mean,
I have an art gallery. Yes.
So how do you go from being a mayor to an art dealer?
Well, in my 20s, when I was a junior high guidance counselor, I would sketch and draw my students when they had been sent out of Mrs. Lowry's room for disrupting the class. Rather than giving them swats, I'd talk to them, but it would relax them if I was sketching them. Then I got involved in politics and got away from art, but just in the last few years, I've started to paint again, painting portraits. I brought you a portrait I've done, and I'm now showing my art and other regional artists at my gallery on 821 Pacific Avenue, above another more established gallery called Minka, M-I-N-K-A.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So that's a side of you that I didn't know, and I thought I knew a lot about you because I remember the time that I went with you to Hershey, Pennsylvania.
Oh yeah.
To meet your mother.
Yeah.
And first time I ever had been to Hershey, which actually does smell like chocolate.
Wow. Wow.
And I don't think you ever talked about you talked about Civil War history, and you talked about a lot about politics on that trip, but I don't think you talked about your artistic background.
Yeah.
at all. So
Wow. Can I tell a story?
absolutely.
I call it a Forrest Gump-like story, how big national, international events affect people's individual lives. My family moved from Pennsylvania and the Maryland area to Tennessee because of Senator Joe McCarthy. You ever heard this?
No.
My father was a professor of sociology at the University of Maryland. He was asked to teach a course on American society at the Pentagon. He was a pacifist during that period of time and a minister. He refused to teach the course. That was enough to get him on the blacklist of Joe McCarthy, and the University of Maryland president asked my father to leave the university because they were losing federal money because of people like him, fellow travelers with the communists, which of course was not true, but Pop applied up and down the East Coast, couldn't get a job in the Northeast because they had the list. And he said, Pop said, we ended up in the University of Tennessee because the list hadn't made it that far south. So because of Senator Joe McCarthy and his wayward politics, I grew up in Tennessee.
All right. And then later your mother moved back to Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Both my folks were.
Oh, interesting.
back.
That's another piece that I had not
Yeah.
heard before.
Yeah.
So, well, that's kind of, yeah. So your father was a pacifist, meaning he was anti-war, but
Right.
but that made him a communist in McCarthy's side.
Right.
So-
Right.
Oh, okay. Well, that's kind of a foreign era.
Politics
to some of
of
us.
today are
Yeah.
come
Very
from the past. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. So, then how did you get to Tacoma from Tennessee?
I got a master's degree at the University of Connecticut in educational psychology. A local Tacoma man was a student at the university with me. He called up Trygve Blix and got me hired as a guidance counselor on the telephone in 1972. So I moved out here from the East Coast, and glad I did.
And Gray was the only school you worked at then, or?
Gray, and then Mount Tahoma.
And then later Mount Tahoma.
I was a counselor at Mount Tahoma, and I taught 1 year at Baker.
Oh,
Yeah,
all right.
all in the South End.
Yeah, well, that is absolutely great, and little bits of stuff about your history that I didn't know, even though we've known each other a very, very long time.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for interviewing me on my show, but mostly thank you for being our guest and for the great opportunities I've had to work with you over the past few years. It's been a pleasure, Brian.
We hope you have a wonderful retirement and a long one.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And to the folks watching the show, I appreciate the fact that you've watched this show for 20 some years, and I hope some of them have been really educational and informative, or at least funny sometimes, because we've tried to be funny, but always that you found them honest and informative, and by someone who actually does really care a great deal about the city of Tacoma. Thank you for watching all these years. Bye.